Wafflebox presents That Mike Fish Show with tonight's guest from the St. Louis Chat Show, Beck Becker. And now, here's your host, Mike Fish. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're listening to this. This is the premiere episode of That Mike Fish Show on the Wafflebox feed. I am, of course, Mike Fish, and I am joined by my very special guest, podcaster and voiceover extraordinaire, because when I introduce him, you're going to be like, God damn, that man's got a beautiful voice. Here's my man, Mr. Beck Becker. How you doing, my man?
Mike, I am good. And first of all, let me just go on record. I had no clue this was your first show. I didn't know this was a separate project. So I'm very impressed. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
We're trying to break off, so we have the Waffle Box, and then we're trying to produce extra content for our good syrup squad, is what I like to say. And so you're what's the word I'm saying? I'm not going to go into that. You're breaking a cherry or whatever they say. Anyway, Becker, first question: is that your real name? And if so, how did you get such an awesome name?
It is partially my real name. The name Beck is actually a nickname that my father gave me when I was younger. A wee tot, if you will.
Okay. How far back are we going? Because I'm thinking, obviously, the first thing I think of is either Boris Becker or Beck the musician. Was he a fan of either one of those, or am I wandering off?
No, my dad, he might know who Boris Becker is, and he sure as hell wouldn't know who Beck is. No, this is going back to when I was very, very small. I'm old. I'm older than I look. And we're talking. I was a little boy. So yeah, it's been a long time.
I remember when this is going with a sidetracking story. I remember when I was about to enjoy my 24th birthday, I think it was, and someone said, "Oh, it's your birthday coming up." I was like, "Yes." They're like, "How old are you going to be? 30?" And I was like, "God, no, I'm only." But now I'm 36 and I look probably like 50 or whatever. Who cares?
No, I don't. Trust me, you don't look 50.
Well, you look like a. Wait. No, I'm not going to. Use 38. 38. Let's go with that. I'm going to guess that's my guess. 38.
We can go with 38. That's fine.
We're going to go with that.
That sounds great to me.
Anyway, where do we start with you, my good young man? Host of the St. Louis Chat Show. And also a voiceover. So I actually do want to, before we're going to get into podcasts, I'm fascinated with podcasts. I love talking to podcasters about how they get into it and what they do. But you obviously also do a little bit of freelance voiceover work. Mm-hmm. And I always wanted to speak to someone who does voiceover work, because it's one of those things where I guess almost like the untrained ear or the untrained eye just thinks, oh, you're just talking. That's all it is.
Yeah.
But it's obviously way more, because I've tried my amateur voiceover work for my own projects and things like that, and it just sounds terrible. So how did you kind of want to get into that, and what is the kind of the background stuff to that? Like, what do you do to practice? What do you do to train your voice? Like, it's obviously way more than people think. So what is your day-to-day in terms of doing that?
Yeah. So actually, before we get to the day-to-day, I'll tell you how it all started. So when I was a young boy, 8, 9, maybe 10 years old, one of my brothers and I, we would grab a little tape recorder and we would do a cheesy talk radio show. And it was a bunch of just dumb 9 or 10-year-old booger jokes, fart jokes, probably highbrow stuff, if you know what I'm getting at.
Classiness.
Yeah. Yeah, sophistication. And I still actually have a couple of those tapes, but there's little micro cassette recorder tapes, and I haven't been able to find a recorder that works and will play them. I would love to hear it again. But so that was kind of my first, oh yeah, I kind of dig this. And then I started doing play-by-play of our neighborhood wiffle ball games or hockey games or whatever. And then developed the sense that, yeah, I think I want to be a DJ. So still as a preteen, being another neighborhood kid would play DJ into a tape recorder. So that kind of became part of who I was. And then as I got into my teens, it really started to consume me a little bit. And of course, my parents are trying to talk me out of it, and I understand why. It's a crap business to be in, but I always wanted to get into radio. So I spent about 5 years as an adult in the radio business, and worked for a couple of different radio stations, and it was fun. Didn't pay worth a damn, and job security was non-existent. And I ended up leaving that business, but still always had a sense. And this is the 90s now we're talking about. So this is before there was the internet and getting into it. I had an agent for a very short amount of time doing voiceover work in the 90s. But at that time I was more focused on preparing for an eventual family and things like that as I got older and moved beyond that. And then after my kids were born, early part of this century, very early part of this century, started to dip my toes back into it and did it for a little while. And then, as what typically happens when you have young kids, that kind of consumes your life. So I got away from it for a little while again, and then got back into it. And that's where we are now, where I'm still kind of cranking away at it, so I do a lot of production work I do work for the clients that you may have heard on our podcast.
Right.
There's some things that I've done for them, and a lot of what I do is around the realm of either I'm in the booth. I've got magazines I'm looking at right now on my desk outside the booth. I use those magazines for practicing. So I just go through those, and I'm it's always my own worst enemy when it came to listening to my work. So, in the very early days when I was on the radio, I started out actually in college radio. I would record the shows and I would listen to them, and I would just rip them apart. And I sucked, but everyone does when you're just getting into it. But man, I was just insanely critical of myself, and almost to a fault, I guess. But but I would look for things that I wanted to improve on. And the same thing applies to doing voiceover work. So continually practicing. I'm reaching out to people who I work with, clients. I'm reaching out to prospects. I'm just basically farming for business. That's a large part of what I do from one day to the next. And the practice piece is part of the mix, because I always want to get better at what I do. And sometimes I get really, I'll have a sense. It's kind of like what with the St. Louis Chat Show podcast. We talked about this for about a year, but I knew what I wanted it to sound like, and I wasn't going to go forward with it until I got it to where I wanted what I wanted it to sound like.
Mm.
And I mentioned this to you before you hit the record button, but we record that thing. It's 60 minutes straight through, and we don't stop. We don't edit. If we screw up, we screw up. And there's been a couple of mistakes in the first couple of shows, and in a way, it's kind of fun, because it reminds me of when I got started in radio, because there were times when I screwed up. In fact, almost dropped an F-bomb on the air once because I kind of zoned out.
At least then you have the dump button.
Yeah, if we didn't have a dump button at this particular station, I would have been dead meat. I did air I did air a phone call briefly between me and a girlfriend at the time. That was interesting. The receptionist came into the studio and said, "Hey, that phone call's on the air." Fortunately,
so she wasn't calling into the show. It was just a private thing, and you accidentally put it on the air.
Yeah. It was totally an accident. And but those are the cool stories that you get out of it. And I've always thought that by going at this stuff, and just really pushing yourself to get better, whether it's voiceovers or whether it's doing podcasting, just kind of sticking your neck out there and doing things the hard way is what makes you better, rather than taking the easy way out.
Right. Because I'm similar in when we do like Waffle Box and things like that, where I prefer just, hey, we hit the record, we hit the stop. That's what we produce. That's what goes out there. Because I feel, and I guess it's each to their own, but I feel if you over edit your end product, you end up relying on that too much. There's almost like a safety net.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just go, okay, what we do is what we do, you just naturally start making sure your first take is the best take, because that's what it is. Whereas I think you progress slower, I think, if you edit too much, because you can, well, if I mess up, I can always edit it out, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. Yeah. And my co-host on the podcast, Mark, he hasn't done this sort of thing before. And he actually does a fantastic job, I think, for someone who's not done anything remotely close to this. And we've known each other for 30 years. So we've known each other 30 plus years. We've known each other a long time, but this is uncharted water for him, but he's kind of wanted to do something like this, something a little more focused on St. Louis, but me thinking bigger picture, I wanted to also have some appeal to people outside of St. Louis. But yeah, to your point, you get rid of the safety net and you're forcing yourself to get better. And what Mark and I did with this podcast is, and I did this knowing that for myself, I dabbled in podcasting probably 15 years ago, 14, 15 years ago, very briefly. And, so it had been a while for me. And when I was on the radio, it was all in 5, 10, 15, 20-second bites because I was doing top 40 radio. So, I was basically the guy that ruined everyone's favorite song because I'm talking over the top of it. And, but getting back into this, I knew it was going to be a bit of a challenge, but it was something that I just wanted to dive headlong into. And where I landed with Mark and myself, I said, well, let's do this. Let's record 2 months worth of, we'll call them promo shows, but we'll use them as our practice opportunities to get better. And you can kind of hear it progressively in those first 8 shows that we did. We didn't have any music or sound effects or anything like that. You can kind of hear it was a little chunky at first, then it kind of improved. And you can hear the same thing when we started, when our show actually debuted the first week of January, it was still a little rough. And there are things that I can pick out that maybe other people wouldn't think twice about that we still hear. But the reality is we've made the sound of our show is, to us, it's improving by leaps and bounds every week. And part of that is due to the fact that we made a commitment to say, okay, we're going to hit the record button. We're going to record for 60 minutes straight. And that's it. And I have a show clock that I go, this is where my radio experience comes in, but I've got a show clock that we use as to keep us on time. And I don't know if you listened to, was it last week's episode? I guess I think it may have been last week's. We went a little long on one of the segments because I lost track of paying attention to the time. But basically, I try to keep us on a schedule. That way, we don't have these segments where we're rambling and we get boring. And there's a lot of podcasts, and God love any podcaster for giving it a go, because I think that podcasting has enabled introverts to some extent to have an outlet also. And I think I think that that's commendable that they are using that to kind of come out of that. And I think I lost my train of thought here, but just by sticking our neck out and just continuing to plow through this, it kind of makes us, I think to get back to my previous point, I think where I was going was that you hear a lot of podcasts where there's a lot of rambling and they just kind of go on, and then it gets to a point where it's tedious. So we've got 3 segments and we know exactly how long they're going to be, and we know when to start winding them down. And that way we're not dragging things out too long.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not, because I think you took a picture where you can kind of see your times out, which is, I'm not as meticulous as that, which I was. But yeah, same thing. I guess I at least when we're recording, I have the timer going. So at least I can kind of see, like, okay, well, we've been doing this for too long now. Let's wrap this up and move it on to the next one. Because like you say, yeah, no one likes, like, Jesus, come on, guys. Let's wrap this up. So I remember, so there's a big podcast community now. Everyone's trying to get a podcast going and everyone's promoting each other and saying, hey, we love your podcast and actually listen to it. But this is the one thing I want to get into, and I want to kind of see how you do it. Is because I always pride myself on, hey, if I'm going to say I'm going to listen to your podcast, I'm going to listen to your podcast. If I say one thing about your podcast, I mean that thing. And if you haven't already listened to the St. Louis Chat Show, I highly recommend it, because my thing, and I said it to you over the Twitter sphere, is my big thing is it doesn't necessarily matter about the subject of the content, is as long as the content is good and you're intrigued by it and you're engrossed by it. And like I said, the St. Louis Chat Show, it's heavily it's not necessarily all about St. Louis, but it's heavily St. Louis themed, shall we say. And obviously, I've never been to St. Louis. I have no idea about any of the references, but I'm hooked and I enjoy listening to this show every single week. And I mean that sincerely. I listen to it. So what is it you think on your end, I guess, that you have or that you do that you've made this, for lack of a better term, a niche podcast, but open to other people outside of that bubble, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and Mark and I talked about this when we were planning it. I said that, you know, it was important for us to do things that are not necessarily going to be St. Louis specific, but things that people might relate to. And maybe there's a St. Louis angle to it, maybe there isn't. In fact, next week's show, that we've got a couple things lined up that are not St. Louis specific at all, and that's going to make a difference. But I think also what helps is if the product sounds good and it sounds appealing and it sounds fun, it makes it a little more enjoyable to listen to, even if you don't understand the topic. Because I'm like you, there are podcasts that I've gotten into that are on subjects maybe I wouldn't otherwise have interest in, but they do such a good job. And it kind of makes you, it engages you a little bit more. And, you know, I hope, and I'd like to think that my radio background and how I'm communicating and talking to the listeners in a way that has maybe a certain energy or vibe, maybe that is connecting with people rather than just getting two guys on there kind of droning on and you know, waxing philosophical about something in St. Louis that maybe some people don't know about.
So, and on a, I guess, a technical standpoint, this is where I'm going to get really in the nitty-gritty. So you record and then that's it, pretty much.
Yeah.
So, okay, this is really technical. So what software or app do you use to record the podcast?
So I record the podcast directly into a Rodecaster Pro. And then on my MacBook, I use Pro Tools and I use Adobe Audition. You know, so what I'll do is obviously snip off the beginning and end because there's some pre-show and post-show chatter that ends up in there. And I'll also run, I've got a couple of mastering presets just to kind of clean up the dreaded mouth clicks and things like that. But once I edit it, I crank it down and I get it to the right specs for Apple, and that's really all there is to it. And you know, I don't want to spend hours on end laboring over Pro Tools or Adobe and trying to slice and dice. You know, so everything that you hear on the show, I mean, I'm hitting the buttons live. I mean, you're hearing all that as it happens. And but that's what I like, though. For myself, I take pride in, it's kind of like being in Top 40 radio. It's a very tight production, right? So, you know, you one song into another, and then the commercials are back to back, and you don't get a lot of, well, you shouldn't have any dead air or anything like that. And that's the same thing that I try to accomplish with this, and the Rodecaster really helps the cause in that regard. And
so where did you, because I see, for those watching, so you can see you've got a fantastic setup in the background. Is that something that you've kind of built up over time, or kind of leaning back to where you were talking about how you started the St. Louis Chat Show? Was this kind of something where you're like, hey, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this right? And so you kind of waited until you built up this setup, if that makes sense. Was it an evolution, or was it, hey, let's get this right first time?
Well, for the voiceover work, I needed this box, for lack of a better term. I needed this. And when I got into voiceover in the first half of the century, or the first 10 years of 21st century, I guess is what I'm getting at, I wasn't quite this sophisticated because, again, like I said, I had priorities with kids or young babies, and just didn't
they get in the way of
they get in the way of everything. Babies are overrated. but you know, I didn't really have the money. I wanted to sink into it at that point, and And then I reached a point where I knew I was going to get back into voiceover, so I just went all in on it because I had the means to do it. And and then with the podcast, like I said, we spent a year working on it. So I had most of the pieces. The Rodecaster, for example, was a purchase that I made, and I bought that probably about a year ago. And keep in mind, our podcast really just went live, not counting the promo episodes we did at the end of the year, just went live in January. So we were building things out at that point and planning what we wanted the show to look like. There was a lot of work that we put into it.
So, okay, just kind of add on to that. Where you say you're working on the podcast for it. So, from, I guess, brainchild to recording your first episode, there was a full calendar year, roughly. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, just from my OCD-ness and kind of maybe I could learn something. What was happening through that year?
We were talking about what we wanted the show to sound like. We were brainstorming different ideas. I mean, we basically have right now, we've got 6 months worth of shows planned out in their entirety already. So initially we started with our first list of ideas, and then we had to cull that down and figure out, okay, well, this idea kind of sucks. It's not going to be worthwhile. And then as you get into it, some other things start to pop up. And, so we had a lot of those conversations, and we spent a lot of time working on the technical aspect because, not so much from my end, but it seemed like we were having issues from Mark's end, and it was very important. And you can actually hear some of the difference in sound starting from the beginning through where we're at today. But even before we started doing any recordings, we were having, over the course of months, we were just constantly going around and around trying to get to the bottom of noise issues we were having, and that took a while. And once we got around it, then we felt like we were good to go. And we did have a timetable. We knew that as we approached the end of 2021, that we wanted to have a trailer out. We wanted to have our promo episodes in the can so we could kind of crank those out. And then we knew that we had to start working on a promotion because we wanted to have some sort of a giveaway out of the box in order to start to develop our audience. So we had all sorts of business things on the back end that we were working on also.
So because obviously I know you're connected up with like local breweries and local companies and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how did those relationships start? Was you kind of producing the show a little bit and then kind of reaching, or they were reaching out to you, or was you kind of shopping this idea? Hey, this is what we got. This is what we think we can do. Do you want to jump on board? How did those relationships kind of start to come around?
Some of it started before January. Well, all of it started before January. What am I saying? Because we had everything in place before then. But what I started to do was get the Twitter account active, and it wasn't picking up a lot of steam, but started to just kind of get out on Twitter and say some dumb things and just kind of maybe get some people hooked on what was going on. And then once we got to the point where we started running the promo episodes, that's when we started to reach out to breweries, restaurants, etc. Say, okay, here's what we've got, and we provided a brief bio. We had a giveaway brief that we gave out, and we said, here's what we're going to offer you, very low risk, and then just kind of talked a little bit about what we're trying to do, who we are, and gave them some samples to listen to, and then one thing led to another, and we were able to pull that off rather quickly.
Because you build up quite a relationship, really, in local. Because it's just what I love about your show is sort of one, even though it is relatively a new-ish show, if you dive in, it sounds like this is something like, oh, how have I missed this? This has been obviously going on for years. Like this,
yeah,
it's such an embedded show. So, what do you equate that to? Again, do you think it's more down to your personal background in terms of you've got longevity working in radio and voiceover and things like that? Or is it down to almost the meticulous planning of, okay, we're going to do this, let's get it right? Or is it kind of a merger of the both? I guess the best kind of question is, if someone's trying to start off and they want to sound professional, where do you think it comes from? Do you think it comes from backgrounds of work on other things first and kind of bring it together? Or do you think it comes, hey, plan, practice almost before you launch?
I think that the planning piece is important, but again, I guess it comes down to what you expect out of your podcast and what you want it to sound like. For me, I wanted it to sound professional, and I wanted it to sound like something you might hear on the radio. And, I do think that my radio background made a difference, because that allowed me to bring in a certain degree of energy and the knowledge of the fact that Mark not having this background, I knew that I had to be kind of on my toes and just kind of keep things going. And he's actually learned quite a bit over the last, what is this, 6 weeks, I guess, into this, where he's getting better himself. And he'll say the same thing. He's getting better at kind of picking things up, and he's able to kind of feed off of what I'm saying and vice versa. So, to answer your question, I think it's all of it combined. And for myself, there's another aspect to it. When I was a teenager, before I took any college classes for radio or took any voice classes in college, when I was a teenager, I always had this idea of what I thought an ideal radio show would sound like. And when you work in the radio business, you're working for other people, so you don't really always have control over that. I used to piss off the general manager at the college station that I was on, because I kind of pushed the envelope a little too much, to the point of cranking the transmitter power up so that, because college radio stations have weak signals, I would crank the transmitter power up so that friends 30 miles away would be able to hear what I was doing. And, but I never really had the opportunity to really do what I truly wanted to do, and where I had complete control over it. And that's kind of where I think that factored, I know that factored into what this show is about also, because it's kind of loose. I don't take myself seriously, Mark, and neither of us take ourselves too seriously. And, it kind of comes out a little bit in what we do.
Yeah. I think my whole thing is it's kind of like you have to strike a balance. I mean, I have zero background in this. I've been doing, I guess, podcasting now for just over a year. So who am I to say anything? But I do feel like sometimes people, because you have to take it seriously in one way, but in the same way, I think some people take it a little too seriously.
Yeah.
In that, one, you hear that it always like sounds very stiff, and this is what we're talking about, or they just kind of like, hey, this is what I'm doing. Oh, I haven't got 2,000 listeners after 2 episodes. Well,
yeah, that's the end of it. Yeah,
that's it. I wasn't going to do it. So, if you was to give someone advice, I guess, getting into podcasting, or even actually, I have an interest, because you have radio background, so I have an interesting theory and question I want to get to in a minute. But if someone's getting into podcasting, and you had to give them a solid advice, and it's only one piece of advice, because obviously we don't go all night, I don't want to keep you up too much. One piece of advice, if someone's like, I'm really into podcasts, I want to start my own podcast, what would it be?
This might piss some people off, but I see it all the time. I think a lot of podcasters spend too much time trying to get other podcasters to listen to their stuff. Now, I appreciate when podcasters do listen to my show, and I do listen to other podcaster stuff, because I like to hear what people are doing, like yourself. But I think there are podcasters who spend way too much time on that, and they don't know who their target audience is, and they don't know how to go after it. And again, I think that's coming from my radio background, and I've told this story in Facebook groups. I may have even said it on Twitter at some point under my Voiceover account. But when I worked in radio, I worked for a hot adult contemporary radio station. And we knew what the ideal listener looked like, to the point where we had a cardboard cutout in the studio. It was a cardboard cutout of a woman, a housewife, and then we had these little speech balloons popping off of it that had little facts and details about who that person was. So then when you were on the air, because you're literally, so if you can see me right now looking at my laptop and I'm seeing you, I'm looking straight ahead in the studio, and I'm seeing the cardboard cutout of our ideal listener.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm basically making the connection and talking to that person.
Right. Okay. I like that.
And I think that and if you don't have that exposure, experience, or whatever, you maybe you're not thinking about that. And I mentioned earlier, I think that podcasting does attract a lot of introverts. And I think that podcasting is great for those people because it's helping them get out of that mode a little bit. But I think that podcasters, to answer your question, and getting a little long-winded, but I think what podcasters should really force themselves to do before they launch, know who their target audience is, and then say, okay, how am I going to go after them? So for instance, ours is a little easier. We knew we were going after people in St. Louis, and we were targeting people who like beer, food, etc., St. Louis themed clothing, things like that. But some of the things that we're doing obviously are meant to attract people from outside of St. Louis. But we know the core audience is St. Louis, so we talk to those people.
Know your audience, absolutely. Because I think if you do it that way, again, I think what it all comes down to is, I don't want to sound like the old person who's like, oh, the problem with today's generation. But I think it's just that immediate gratification. I think some people, rather than, they just want instant success. Whereas I think, like you say, if people follow what you're saying, hey, if you get lucky, you might pop off and go nuts. But if it might be a slower growth,
yeah,
it's going to be a solid growth, because you will slowly build up that solid listener base. And it's just going to benefit you in the long run if you just know who you want to attract, who you're talking to, and stick to it. I think it's going to benefit you in the long run.
Yeah. When I first dabbled in podcasting the first time around, podcasting was a lot smaller and a lot newer. Had I stuck with it, there's no telling what I would have been doing at this point. And the difference between radio and this, on the radio, all I had to do was flip the mic on, and I knew that I had tens of thousands of people who were listening to me. And the very first time you do that in a professional setting, by the way, let me tell you, you get a little tense.
Well, I imagine.
But but podcasting is a completely different animal, because you don't have that built-in audience that's carrying over from the previous show that you might have on a radio station. You don't have that built-in audience. So you got to start from ground zero. And that takes work. And it takes, again, going back to what I said, it takes knowing who you're supposed to be talking to.
Absolutely. Last thing I kind of want to touch on is kind of almost an abstract idea, because you had the radio background, and there was kind of a time when people were like, oh, radio's dead, like yada, yada, yada. Everyone's. Now, I have a theory, and I want to see if you kind of agree, because it's almost like I feel that podcasting started the downturn of radio in one way.
Yeah.
But I almost feel that radio is kind of on the up because of podcasts as well. It's almost like I feel that people getting into podcasts have now kind of, they're looking at radio different, because I know a lot of radio stations and a lot of radio shows around here who are very popular. It's almost maybe people are seeing them as like, oh, it's like a live podcast that I can phone in and interact with.
Yeah.
It's like radio's evolved almost. Because am I in the wrong way, or am I onto something?
No,
now?
I wouldn't disagree with that. The one thing that I think has changed in radio, and I got out in the I got fired. I was kind of forced out, and at that point,
No, you got out.
Yeah,
it was their loss.
Yeah, exactly. And but radio has changed so much. I think it's lost some of its edge. And when I left the radio business, at that point, the regulations for radio station ownership were changing. and then it became a lot more corporate. So you didn't have, so if you go from one city to the next, you're kind of hearing the same thing, the same format, the same, in some
I have
cases, you might
songs over and over again.
yeah, and you might even hear the same voices on the radio because voice tracking, where you've got someone like myself could potentially sit in St. Louis, for example, and be a DJ on a radio station in St. Louis or Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia or wherever. But they try to play it off as if it's local, but you can tell that it's not. If you've got an ear for it, you know what it sounds like. You know that you're listening to someone who's not local. So on some level, I think you're right that it's kind of feeding radio in a positive way, but there are ways from someone who worked in that business that I know that it's still on the downswing just in terms of advertising revenue and connection with the local audience and things like that.
I guess it's kind of, I guess, would you equate it to how like network television has been affected by streaming platforms and that kind of thing?
Definitely. Yeah, there were more choices. Or once there's more choices, then something's got to give. And especially if you add to the mix, you're listening to the radio and you're hearing someone who doesn't really have a connection to the city, so they're not really talking to you from a position of, yeah, we relate to what you're doing or what you like or whatever. That creates this disconnect.
Oh, the good old days when there was only 4 channels on my TV in England back in the day. Now,
oh yeah, I remember that.
Kids don't appreciate it now. I'm getting to that point already. I'm good. And also, by the way, before we end the show, may I just commend you on your fantastic hairstyle. I always, whenever I see someone who has a bald head, I get jealous because, as you might be able to see on the video, I'm going very receding and very light. I wish to do what you done, but my wife was like, "No, you can't do it." Like,
oh, go for
please let me. It's just let me take it gracefully. But so
go for it. Yeah, just once you go all in on it, you'll thank yourself. And the honest truth is, my toupee is at the dry cleaners. So.
Is it, I want to. Is it like
That's such an old joke?
What was that? Like a nice mullet with like a braid at the back.
There you go.
Go into it.
I used to joke that I could grow my hair out, and there wouldn't be a whole hell of a lot on top. I said I could grow my hair out, put it in a tail, I'd look like Ben Franklin, which would not be a cool look.
It's a look, though.
It's a look.
Bring it back.
That's not necessarily a good thing.
This is why I think I've just grown the beard so to overcompensate.
I kind of wish I actually shaved the head and the beard earlier today. I actually had a little bit of facial hair going. I should have hung on to it just for this conversation.
If you'd have turned up with a beard, I'd have been
not a full beard. Yeah, not a full beard, but
hey, beard's a beard, my friend.
That's right.
Got to stick together. Okay, so where can people who are listening to this find you? Because I know obviously you got your own social media, you got the St. Louis Chat Shows, the feed. Tell people where they can find you and listen to you every Wednesday. New episodes,
every Wednesday. Right? That is correct. That's another. If you don't mind me derailing for just a minute, I think that
go for it.
That if someone wants to be successful at podcasting, figure out what your schedule is up front and stick to it. Because if you get random and your listeners don't know what to expect, you're not going to succeed. So in any event, if you're on Twitter, you can find me. My personal Twitter is Beck Becker VO. STL Chat Show is our Twitter handle for the podcast. You can also check out my website, beckbecker.com.
What a name. Like with a name like that, how can you not follow this man? I wish I had
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Beck Becker. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I know it's kind of like a weird composition and grab you in this, but thank you very much for joining us. I've been fascinated to learn about your background. Definitely. And again, I say this sincerely. I don't pimp many podcasts, but if you are going to check out the St. Louis Chat Show, it's super cool. Most of them, they try to be cool, but I'm not going to talk bad of it. But yes, this podcast is very good. I have a very few podcasts in my rotation This is one of them. Check it out. St. Louis Chat Show every Wednesday. New episodes coming out wherever you find podcasts. Beck Becker, thank you very much for joining me.
I appreciate it.
I super appreciate it. Make sure you check out all the podcasts on this feed. Go to enjoywafflebox.com. New episodes of Wafflebox come out each and every Wednesday. Listen to that first, then listen to the St. Louis Chat Show. Make sure you listen to my show first, then his. But, listen to both, but mine first.
Priorities.
Check us out. Thank you very much, Beck Becker, and we'll bid you a very good night. Take care.